The air was thick with the scent of decaying leaves as the small town of Harrow's Hill prepared for its annual Halloween festival, a night when the line between the living and the dead blurred. For most, it was just another excuse to dress up, carve pumpkins, and share ghost stories. But for a handful of locals, the night held a far darker purpose. A tradition passed down through generations, kept secret from the outsiders who populated the town. As dusk settled over the hill, a strange chill enveloped the streets, creeping into the bones of anyone who dared to stay outside too long. At the heart of Harrow's Hill stood the Holloway Mansion, an imposing structure that had long been abandoned. The townspeople spoke of its cursed history, how the original owners, the Holloway family, vanished without a trace on Halloween night over a century ago, and how the mansion had been empty ever since, its windows dark and empty, as though the house itself were holding its breath. It was said that on every Halloween night the mansion came alive, with whispers echoing from within and strange lights flickering in the windows, as if the spirits of the Holloway family still lingered, waiting for something, or someone. Tonight, 4 friends, Cassie, Jake, Naomi, and Mark, decided to test the legends for themselves. All were skeptical, thinking it was nothing more than local superstition, the kind of ghost story meant to thrill children and keep them out of trouble. Armed with nothing more than flashlights, their phones, and an inflated sense of bravery, they made their way to the mansion. As they passed the rusted gates, a messenger sending a shiver down their spines. "It's just the wind," Jake muttered, but even his voice quivered slightly. They reached the front door, its wooden frame sagging with age, the darkened windows staring back at them like hollow eyes. Mark, always the most daring, pushed the door open with a creak that seemed to echo across the desolate lawn. The air inside was thick with dust, the remnants of a long-forgotten past. Faded wallpaper peeled from the walls, revealing rotting beams beneath. As they ventured further into the mansion, the silence pressed in on them, broken only by the soft shuffle of their footsteps. Cassie's flashlight flickered, casting long, distorted shadows across the room. She was about to say something when she heard it. A faint, guttural whisper, too soft to understand, but undeniably there. Naomi froze, her face pale as the sound grew louder, like a distant chant. Jake tried to laugh it off, but the uneasy feeling gnawing at the pit of his stomach couldn't be ignored. The walls seemed to close in around them as they moved deeper into the house, the air growing colder with each step. It wasn't just the temperature, it was a sense of something watching them, waiting. The walls seemed to close in around them as they moved deeper into the house. The walls filled in with tremble, mournful wail, rising in pitch until it was a scream, a voice full of pain and terror. The floorboards groaned underfoot, and for a brief moment Mark thought he saw something move in the corner of his eye, a dark figure darting across the hallway. He turned, but nothing was there. The staircase loomed ahead like a black maw, but none of them dared speak. Instead, they ascended, the steps creaking under their weight, the air thick with anticipation. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched out before them like a dark corridor of doom. They moved toward the last door at the end of the hall, the one they'd heard stories about, where the Holloway family had supposedly vanished. The door was ajar, as though waiting for them. Cassie stepped forward, her hand trembling as she reached for the knob. The moment she touched it, the door swung open violently, slamming against the wall with a deafening bang. They all stumbled back, their hearts pounding. The room inside was unlike anything they had expected. There was no dust, no decay. Instead, it was pristine, almost as if untouched by time, its walls adorned with antique furniture and portraits of the Holloway family. But something was wrong. The faces in the portraits seemed to be watching them. And in the centre of the room stood an ornate mirror, its surface too perfect, too still. Cassie's reflection was the first to change. Slowly her face twisted into a grotesque, unnatural grin, one that didn't belong to her. She screamed, but the reflection did not. It laughed, an unnerving, hollow laugh that seemed to echo from every corner of the room. The others tried to pull her away, but their own reflections began to shift, contorting into twisted, nightmarish versions of themselves. The door slammed shut behind them, trapping them inside. The whispers grew louder, now a cacophony of voices, some pleading, others mocking. And in the centre of the room, a dark shape began to form. Something tall and gaunt, its eyes burning like embers. The figure stepped forward, its footsteps reverberating through the floor as the air grew thick with a presence that was both ancient and malevolent. It spoke in a voice that sounded like 1,000 voices in one. "You should never have come here." Suddenly, the mansion seemed to come alive. The floorboards groaned and cracked, the walls bending inward, as though the house itself was trying to consume them. The friends tried to escape, but every door led them back to the same room, the same cursed mirror, as the figure advanced, its dark fingers reaching out for them. One by one, their reflections began to pull them toward the mirror, dragging them into the glass, their screams echoing in the emptiness as their bodies were consumed by the mansion's twisted curse. The last thing they saw, before they were swallowed by the dark, was the hollow, twisted smile of the Holloway family, trapped for eternity, just like them. The house fell silent once more, its secrets buried with the souls it claimed. The only sound that remained was the whisper of the wind, carrying the echoes of their screams into the night. And as the clock struck midnight, the Holloway mansion waited for its next victims. The wind outside howled as if mourning the lost souls trapped within the Holloway mansion. The night stretched on, heavy with the weight of something ancient, something evil, that had settled deep within the mansion's bones. But in the quiet aftermath, no one was left to witness the terrible truth. The house remained still, as though it had devoured everything in its path. Its walls now hungrier than before. The wind, once so loud, faded into a deathly silence, an eerie calm that only deepened the sense of foreboding. But just as the clock struck 2 a.m., something stirred within the mansion. The faintest rustle, like dry leaves shifting in the wind, echoed from deep within the shadows. The mirror in the cursed room began to ripple. It wasn't a reflection anymore. It was something more sinister. A tear in reality, a portal between the worlds of the living and the dead. Slowly, a face began to emerge from the glass, pale and warped, its eyes wide with terror. It was Cassie. Her face, once contorted with fear, now bore the hollow, vacant expression of one who had crossed beyond the veil. Her lips moved, but the words were muffled, distant. "Help me." Mark's reflection, distorted beyond recognition, appeared beside her, his body twisted at unnatural angles, his mouth opened, and a low, guttural voice escaped. We are trapped Forever. From the depths of the mirror, the air seemed to shimmer and crack as something reached out. Something far worse than any of them had imagined. It was a hand, long and skeletal, the fingers unnaturally long, stretching through the glass like tendrils of death. One by one, the twisted reflections of Cassie, Jake, Naomi, and Mark reached out to the real world. Their cries grew louder, more desperate, the mirrors now reflecting them not as they were, but as they had become. Twisted, empty husks of the people they once were, their spirits forever bound to the mansion. Outside, the town of Harrow's Hill carried on, blissfully unaware of the horrors unfolding within the mansion's walls. The Halloween festival had ended, and children wandered home with sacks of candy, their laughter echoing through the streets. But deep inside the mansion, something far more sinister was stirring. The Holloway family, those lost souls, had never truly disappeared. Their curse was not one of death, but of eternal entrapment, forced to live out their final moments over and over again, feeding off the terror of those who dared enter their domain. Each Halloween, the mansion claimed new victims, adding to the collection of souls bound to its malevolent will. But tonight was different. Tonight, the mansion seemed to pulse with a strange dark energy. The ritual was incomplete. The mansion was hungry, more ravenous than before. It needed more than just the souls of the four friends. It needed the living. The Holloway family's curse had not only consumed the spirits of those trapped inside, but it had begun to reach out, pulling in the town of Harrow's Hill, feeding off its fears, its darkest desires. Back in the mansion, the dark figure that had confronted the friends, the one with ember-like eyes, had not gone away. It now stood at the centre of the room, towering over the broken, twisted mirror. Its form was shifting, swirling in an otherworldly way, like smoke from a dying fire. It was no longer just a figure. It was a presence, a force. Its voice, low and rasping, filled the room once more. The ritual is near completion. More souls are needed. The floor trembled. The house groaned, as if it too was aware of the evil that now thrived within it. From every corner of the mansion, a terrible sound echoed. Whispers, screams, sobs, the agonizing wails of the lost souls who had been consumed over the years. Naomi, her eyes wide with terror, tried to reach for the door, but it slammed shut with a deafening thud. "We have to get out," she cried. But the words were lost in the whirlwind of sound. And then it happened. The walls of the mansion seemed to bleed, dark tendrils of shadow creeping out from every crack, every corner. The portraits on the walls of the Holloway family began to change, their eyes shifting, moving, locking onto the group. The faces of the family in the paintings twisted into grotesque, leering expressions, as though they were mocking the intruders. The floor beneath them seemed to soften and shift like wet clay, as if the mansion itself was trying to swallow them whole. In the midst of the chaos, Cassie's reflection, still caught in the mirror, suddenly grinned, a twisted, impossibly wide smile that stretched across her face. "It's too late," she whispered from within the glass. "You're already part of us." The room began to close in on them, the darkness thick and suffocating, swirling around them like a living thing. The last thing they saw before the blackness overwhelmed them was the Holloway family, no longer just paintings or whispers, but real, alive, and they were reaching out from the walls, from the floor, from every corner. The friends screamed, but their voices were drowned out by the growing cacophony, the laughter, and the dark, insidious chant. As the clock struck 3, the Holloway mansion stood still once more. No one had ever escaped. No one ever would. The house would wait patiently, hungrily, for its next victims. And as the whispers died down, a single word echoed through the silence. Forever. As the final echoes of the word forever dissolved into the suffocating silence, the mansion seemed to exhale. A deep, rattling breath that reverberated through its rotting timbers. The clock on the wall, cracked and dust-covered, slowly ticked away the seconds, marking the end of another doomed chapter in the mansion's cursed history. But something had changed. Outside, the first hints of dawn began to creep over the horizon, painting the sky with faint streaks of grey and orange. Harrow's Hill still slumbered, blissfully unaware of the horrors that fester just beyond its borders. The streets were empty, save for the fallen leaves that swirled lazily along the curbs, unbothered by the passing of time. Inside the mansion, the last remnants of the friends' screams seemed to hang in the air, lingering like a thick fog that refused to lift. The cursed mirror, now shattered into 1,000 jagged shards, still glimmered with an unnatural light. But there was no sign of the 4 friends. No trace of their spirits, only the faintest imprint of their terror still hanging in the room, a reminder of their doomed fate. Then, from the darkest corner of the mansion, a low, unsettling sound began to rise. Whispers, like a chorus of voices speaking in unison. The walls groaned and creaked as if alive, moving to a rhythm only the house could understand. From the cracks in the floorboards, thin black tendrils began to emerge, twisting and writhing like snakes in the dark, slowly pulling themselves together in a horrific, macabre dance. The Holloway family portraits, their faces now more grotesque than ever, twisted in the shadows, their eyes burning with malevolent joy. The portraits, once mere images, seemed to ripple and blur, as if the family was no longer confined to paint and frame. They were becoming real, slipping free from the constraints of their painted prisons. The eyes of the Holloway ancestors shifted, locking onto the now empty space where the friends had once stood. And then, the floor beneath them, beneath everyone, shuddered. The mansion had been hungry, yes, but it was also waiting. For years the curse had been a chain, an endless loop of souls consumed on Halloween night. But this night, this Halloween, something was different. The ritual, though incomplete, had brought a new kind of power into the house. The house had evolved. It was no longer just a place of death, it was a gateway. With a sharp, ear-piercing crack, the mirror shattered completely, scattering its shards across the floor like shattered stars. The whispers reached a deafening crescendo, filling the house with the sound of thousands of voices crying out in agony and despair. In the final horrific moment, the mansion itself seemed to pulse. A dark heartbeat, slow and deliberate, shaking the very foundations of the earth beneath it. And then it opened. From the deep blackness where the friends had once stood, a figure began to emerge. At first, it was a silhouette, a shifting shadow against the abyss that had swallowed them. It was hard to make out its form at first, but as the shape grew clearer, the figure's hollow, burning eyes became unmistakable. It was Cassie, or at least what remained of her. Her body was thin, skeletal, her skin ashen and decayed, but her eyes were wide and frantic, filled with the same terror they had carried when she first crossed the threshold of the house. She reached out with bony hands, her fingers stretching toward the door. But there was something else in her eyes now, something darker than fear. There was hunger. Behind her, the other friends followed, their bodies distorted, broken. Naomi's hair was matted with blood, and her face was twisted with a grotesque, silent scream. Mark's mouth was open, frozen in an eternal howl of despair, while Jake, his face pale and unrecognizable, stumbled forward, his eyes glazed over with a dull, hollow emptiness. They moved like puppets, their bodies forced into unnatural contortions by the twisted power of the mansion, as though the house had taken control of their very souls. Cassie's voice, a distorted, inhuman version of it, whispered in the air, a rasping, guttural sound that scraped the very walls of the mansion. "You can't escape," she croaked, her voice joined by the others, now a chorus of despair. "We are the Holloway. We are the house." As they moved toward the door, the mansion groaned in protest, its walls shuddering as if struggling against its own power. But the door opened. For the first time in over a century, the house relented, allowing the once prisoners of the cursed mansion to pass through. The four friends, now nothing more than extensions of the house itself, stepped out into the early morning light, their faces twisted into the same empty, hollow smiles that the Holloway family had worn for generations. As they crossed the threshold, the mansion behind them began to pulse once more, alive and aware, as though the souls it had devoured were feeding its strength. The ground beneath them trembled again, but it was too late. The house was no longer just a prison. It had become something else. From within the depths of the mansion, the Holloway family, the true masters of the house, watched, their faces leering with satisfaction. The curse had been completed. As the four lost souls moved into the town, the wind picked up again, colder now, carrying the same whispers that had once filled the mansion. The town of Harrow's Hill was about to awaken, and when it did, the curse would be unleashed once more. The Holloway mansion would hunger again, and this time it would not stop. The shadows stretched long, and in the distance the faintest sound of whispers echoed through the streets, slowly growing louder as the sun began to rise. But there was no one left to hear them, only the wind and the Holloway family.